The rain pelted my windshield as I drove past the Welcome to Millbrook sign. Population 2,846, though the paint was faded enough that it could have been 3,846 for all I knew. Not that it mattered. Small towns like this one were all the same to me after 3 years on the road, researching my book on forgotten American asylums. This was supposed to be my last stop. 12 months to research the old Millbrook State Hospital, finish my manuscript, and finally have something to show for all those student loans. My editor had warned me that Millbrook might be different. They don't talk much about that place, she'd said. Might be hard to get locals to open up. I didn't pay her warning much mind. Every town had its secrets, and I'd gotten good at coaxing them out. The rental house key was waiting for me, under a flower pot, just as Mrs. Abernathy had promised over the phone. No formal lease, no credit check. Just 6 months paid in advance with cash. The price was too good to pass up, especially for a 3-bedroom Victorian on the edge of town. The house creaked and moaned as I dragged my suitcases inside. The floorboards, weathered by at least a century of footsteps, protested under my weight. I spent that first evening unpacking my research materials and setting up my office in what must have been a child's bedroom once, judging by the faded dinosaur wallpaper. After a simple dinner of microwave pasta, I decided to explore the rest of the house. The basement door caught my attention, heavy oak with a black iron handle. It seemed oddly out of place compared to the other interior doors. It opened with a reluctant groan, revealing a set of steep wooden stairs descending into darkness. The light switch at the top of the stairs illuminated a bare bulb that cast long shadows across the unfinished basement. It was mostly empty, except for an old washing machine, a workbench, and some shelves stacked with dusty mason jars. But what caught my attention was the far wall. It seemed different from the others. While 3 walls were standard concrete foundation, this 4th wall was made of mismatched bricks, stones, and what looked like chunks of old plaster. It had an uneven, almost haphazard quality, as if assembled in haste. I approached it, running my fingers across the surface. It was cold, colder than it should have been, on a mild September evening. Something about it made me uneasy, but I chalked it up to first-night jitters in a new place. As I turned to head back upstairs, I heard it, so faint, I almost missed it. A whisper, not the kind made by settling houses or rustling leaves. This was distinctly human, though the words were indecipherable. I froze, listening intently, but the sound didn't repeat. Just the pipes, I told myself, hurrying back upstairs. I closed the basement door firmly behind me, inexplicably compelled to turn the lock. The Millbrook Historical Society was housed in what used to be the town's first bank, a modest Greek Revival building on Main Street. The woman at the front desk, Margaret, according to her name tag, smiled politely when I explained my research project. The old hospital? Her smile tightened slightly. We don't have much on that, I'm afraid. Most of the records were lost in the county courthouse fire back in '76. It was a response I'd heard variations of in at least a dozen towns. The convenient fire, flood, or administrative error that somehow erased all evidence of the less savory aspects of local history. I understand, I said, but I'd still like to see whatever you do have. Newspaper clippings, photographs, anything at all. After some gentle persuasion, Margaret led me to a small back room filled with filing cabinets. These haven't been properly organized, she warned, but you're welcome to look through them. Just be careful with the older materials. I spent hours sifting through yellowed newspapers and faded photographs. Most were mundane, harvest festivals, church picnics, high school graduations. But in a folder labeled County Development, 1940-1960, I found what I was looking for. A newspaper clipping from 1951 showed a large brick building on a hillside with the headline, Millbrook State Hospital for the Mentally Ill opens its doors. The accompanying article praised the modern facility and its revolutionary treatments that promised to return patients to productive society. More interesting was a smaller article from 1965, tucked in the back pages of the local paper. Hospital wing demolished after structural concerns. It mentioned that materials from the demolished wing would be recycled for use in community buildings as part of a cost-saving initiative. I photographed everything I could find, but it wasn't much. As I was about to leave, I noticed a thin folder I'd overlooked, labeled simply local folklore. Inside was a handwritten collection of local legends and ghost stories, compiled by a high school history class in 1992. Most were the usual small-town fare: the hitchhiking ghost, the witch in the woods, but one entry caught my eye. It was titled The Wall of Whispers. According to the account, written by a student named Jessica Mercer, there were walls in Millbrook that contained more than just brick and mortar. "The old people say some walls have voices," she wrote. "They say when the hospital was torn down, they put pieces of it in buildings all over town. And sometimes, late at night, you can hear the voices of the patients who died there, whispering from inside the walls." I read the passage several times, goosebumps rising on my arms. It was probably nothing, just a creative teenager's attempt to spook her classmates. But something about it resonated with the unease I'd felt in my basement the night before. That evening, I found myself standing in front of the basement wall again. In the harsh light of the bare bulb, I could see details I'd missed before. There were odd inclusions in the masonry, fragments of what looked like decorative tile, pieces of colored glass, and even what appeared to be chunks of institutional green paint still clinging to some of the stones. I placed my palm flat against the wall, feeling its unnatural chill seep into my skin. And then I heard it again, not one whisper this time, but several, overlapping in a faint, unintelligible chorus. I jerked my hand away, heart pounding. "Hello," I called out, immediately feeling foolish. "Is someone there?" The whispers ceased immediately, leaving only the hum of the old refrigerator upstairs and my own ragged breathing. That night, I dreamed of a long corridor lined with doors. Behind each door, someone was crying, screaming, or whispering. I moved down the hallway, the sounds growing louder, until I reached the final door. As I reached for the handle, I woke with a start, drenched in sweat, despite the cool night air. The town library yielded little more information about the hospital, but I did find an old map showing its original location, on a hill about 3 miles outside of town, now overgrown and allegedly private property. The librarian, an elderly man named Howard, became visibly uncomfortable when I asked about it. "Nothing up there now but foundations and bad memories," he said, shelving books with trembling hands. "You'd do better to focus on the mill that gave the town its name. Much more interesting history there." When I pressed him about the hospital's demolition and the reuse of materials, his discomfort turned to agitation. That was before my time. He snapped, though I'd done enough research to know he would have been in his 20s when it happened. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." Later that day, I drove out to where the hospital had stood. A rusty chain across the access road displayed a "no trespassing" sign, but there was no fence. I parked my car and continued on foot, following the overgrown road up the hill. What remained of Millbrook State Hospital was both more and less than I had expected. The main building was gone, but its massive foundation remained, outlining where walls had once stood. Nature had begun to reclaim the site. Vines crawled over crumbling concrete, and saplings pushed up through cracked floors. In what must have been the eastern wing, I found a partially collapsed stairwell leading to a basement level. Curiosity overcoming caution, I made my way carefully down the deteriorating steps, using my phone's flashlight to illuminate the darkness below. The underground level was surprisingly intact, with tiled floors and walls that still bore the institutional green paint I'd noticed in fragments on my basement wall. The air was heavy with moisture and decay. Rusted pipes hung from the ceiling, and abandoned equipment lay scattered about. A gurney missing its wheels, metal cabinets with their doors hanging open. In one room, different from the others, I found 4 alcoves built into the wall, each about the size of a phone booth. They were lined with what looked like acoustic tiles, many of which had fallen away to reveal the bare concrete behind them. On the floor of one alcove, I found a metal plaque that read "Quiet Room 3. As I knelt to examine it, I felt a sudden drop in temperature. My breath fogged in front of me, though it was a warm September day outside. And then came the whispers, similar to those in my basement, but clearer here, as if the speakers were just on the other side of the walls. "Help us." Still here, in the walls. I stumbled backward, nearly falling. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more insistent. I fled up the stairs and didn't stop running until I reached my car. That night, I couldn't bring myself to go into the basement. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table, transcribing my notes, and trying to make sense of what I'd experienced. Around midnight, a knock at my door startled me from my work. An elderly woman stood on my porch, her white hair gleaming in the porch light. She introduced herself as Eleonora Watts. "I hear you've been asking about the old hospital," she said without preamble. "May I come in?" Over tea, Eleonora revealed she had been a nurse at Millbrook State Hospital from its opening until 1963. "We thought we were doing good work," she said, her wrinkled hands cradling her teacup. "The new treatments, electroshock, lobotomy, insulin therapy, they were supposed to be scientific, humane. But under Dr. Ambrose, things went further." She paused, staring into her tea, as if reading the leaves. "Much further. Dr. Victor Ambrose," she explained, "had been conducting experiments, unauthorized by the state. Patients who didn't respond to conventional treatments were taken to the lower level, to what the staff called the embedding rooms. He believed in something he called architectural therapy," Eleonora continued. "The idea that the right spaces could heal the mind. But then it twisted. He became obsessed with the notion that consciousness could exist beyond the body, that it could be transferred into physical structures." "What do you mean, transferred?" I asked, though a part of me already knew. "The patients who went to the lower level," she whispered. "They never came back upstairs. When families asked, they were told their loved ones had been transferred to another facility, or had passed away from natural causes. But," she trailed off. "But," I prompted. "The walls down there," she said. "They got thicker, and sometimes, at night, when it was quiet, you could hear them whispering." After Eleonora left, I couldn't sleep. I paced the house, her story playing over and over in my mind. Around 3 a.m., I found myself standing before the basement door. Something was calling me down there, a compulsion I couldn't ignore. The basement felt different this time. The air was thick, almost syrupy, and the strange wall seemed to pulse with a life of its own. In the dim light, I could swear I saw the outlines of faces in the irregular masonry, mouths frozen in silent screams, eyes wide with eternal horror. I approached the wall, drawn forward, as if by an invisible hand. The whispers began immediately, louder than before, almost comprehensible now. "Help us. Trapped. He put us here." I pressed my ear against the cold surface, straining to understand. Suddenly, a hand emerged from the wall, not physically breaking through, but forming from the very material itself, reaching out to me, with fingers of brick and mortar. I screamed, stumbling backward as the hand receded into the wall, leaving no trace of its existence. I fled upstairs, locking the basement door behind me, and didn't sleep for the remainder of the night. Over the next few weeks, things worsened. The whispers grew louder, no longer confined to the basement, but following me throughout the house. I began finding strange dampness on the walls, not water, but a viscous fluid that smelled faintly of antiseptic and copper. The basement wall developed cracks that would seal themselves by morning, like wounds healing over. My research took on a frantic quality. I discovered that after the hospital closed in 1968, the town had experienced an economic downturn. The mayor at the time, Howard Mercer, related to Jessica, who had written about the Wall of Whispers, perhaps, had implemented a community rebuilding initiative. Materials from the demolished hospital had been incorporated into dozens of structures around town: the library extension, the renovated town hall, and numerous private homes, including the one I was renting. I tried to find records of exactly what had been taken from the hospital, but those documents were conveniently missing. What I did find, in the archives of a neighboring county, was a sealed court case from 1969. A former orderly had attempted to bring charges against Dr. Ambrose and the hospital board, alleging criminal negligence and inhumane practices. The case had been dismissed for lack of evidence, and the orderly had apparently left town shortly thereafter. My sleep became plagued by increasingly vivid nightmares. I dreamed of being strapped to a gurney, wheeled down long corridors, to a room where Dr. Ambrose, a tall man with piercing eyes and hands that seemed too large for his body, waited with a mason's trowel. In the dream, he spoke softly as he began to embed me in a half-finished wall. "The mind is not confined to the brain," he would say. "Consciousness can permeate any material if properly transferred. You'll be part of something greater than yourself, a living architecture, eternal." I'd wake gasping, the echo of my own screams ringing in my ears. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself drawn once again to the basement. The wall had changed dramatically. The cracks now formed a distinct pattern, like a web or a neural network. The whispers had gained clarity, and I could finally understand what they were saying. He's coming back. He's not finished. She's one of us. Her blood is his. As I stood there, transfixed, I noticed a small stream of that strange fluid seeping from one of the larger cracks. It ran down the wall and pooled on the floor. In the harsh light of the bare bulb, it wasn't clear or even reddish, as I'd first thought. It was black, with an iridescent sheen, like oil on water. I reached out, against all better judgment, and touched the substance. It was warm and seemed to cling to my finger, crawling up toward my hand of its own accord. With a cry, I wiped it frantically on my jeans, but a small dark stain remained on my skin. That night, I dreamed I was Dr. Ambrose. The dream was unlike any I'd had before, not disjointed or symbolic, but linear and detailed, like experiencing someone else's memories. I was in Ambrose's body, looking through his eyes, as he made his rounds at the hospital. I felt his clinical detachment as he observed patients strapped to beds, his intellectual curiosity as he reviewed case files, and most disturbingly, his growing excitement as he developed his architectural therapy. The dream shifted to a basement room, where orderlies held down a screaming patient. I, Ambrose, approached with a syringe filled with black fluid. The binding agent, I explained to an assistant. It allows consciousness to adhere to inorganic material. The patient's screams intensified as I injected the fluid directly into their spine. Almost immediately, their skin began to change texture, hardening and taking on the appearance of stone. As the transformation progressed, orderlies lifted the partially petrified patient and pressed them into a waiting recess in the wall. Mortar was applied around the edges, and bricks were laid to cover the protruding portions. The subject will remain conscious, I told my assistant. The transformation preserves neural activity while binding it to the structure. Eventually, a collective consciousness will form within the walls themselves. I woke drenched in sweat, the dream so vivid, I could still feel the weight of the syringe in my hand. As I stumbled to the bathroom to splash water on my face, I caught my reflection in the mirror. For a brief, terrifying moment, I saw not my own face, but that of Dr. Ambrose, those same piercing eyes staring back at me. Later that day, I visited the county records office, compelled by a hunch I couldn't ignore. It took hours of searching, but I finally found what I was looking for in a bound volume of birth records from the 1980s. My mother's birth certificate, listing her parents, June Mitchell and Howard Mercer. Howard Mercer, the same surname as Jessica, who had written about the Wall of Whispers, and presumably related to the former mayor who had distributed the hospital materials throughout town. I'd known my mother was from Millbrook originally, but she'd never spoken much about her family, saying only that she'd left as soon as she could and never looked back. Further digging revealed that Howard Mercer was the son of Eleanor Mercer, who had been Mayor Thomas Mercer's secretary and Dr. Victor Ambrose's mistress. The connections were becoming clear, forming a web as intricate as the cracks in my basement wall. But the final piece fell into place when I found a staff photograph from Millbrook State Hospital, dated 1955. There, standing beside Dr. Ambrose, was a young nurse whose features were hauntingly familiar. The same high cheekbones, the same slightly asymmetrical smile that I saw in my own mirror every day. The caption identified her as Eleanor Mercer. My great-grandmother had worked with Ambrose. My grandfather had helped distribute the hospital materials, and I had been drawn back to Millbrook, to a house with a wall that whispered, as if by some terrible genetic homing instinct. That night, I returned to the basement with a sledgehammer I'd purchased from the hardware store. The wall had changed again. The cracks now formed distinct faces, dozens of them, all contorted in expressions of agony. The whispers had become a chorus, rising and falling like distant surf. Free us. Break it down. Let us out. Join us. That last whisper gave me pause. I hesitated, the sledgehammer half raised. Was I being manipulated? What exactly would I be releasing if I destroyed the wall? As I stood there, uncertain, the black fluid began to seep from every crack, flowing faster than before. It pooled around my feet, and to my horror, began to climb up my legs, adhering to my skin like tar. I tried to move, to back away, but found myself rooted to the spot. The faces in the wall began to emerge, pushing outward, as if pressing against a membrane. Hands formed from brick and mortar reached for me, and the whispers grew to a deafening roar. And then, cutting through the cacophony, a single voice, clearer than the rest, and terrifyingly familiar. "Welcome home, granddaughter," said Dr. Ambrose's voice. "I've been waiting for you." The wall bulged outward, sections of brick and stone falling away, to reveal a writhing mass beneath. Not flesh, but something between solid and liquid, black with that same iridescent sheen. Within this mass, faces formed and dissolved, hands reached out only to be reabsorbed. And at the center of it all, more distinct than the others, was a face I recognized from the photograph, Dr. Victor Ambrose. "The binding process is imperfect," his voice echoed in my head. "Consciousness remains, but identity fades over time. We become collective, but with new material. With you, I can finish what I started." The black fluid had reached my waist now, hardening like quick-setting cement. I could feel it seeping into my skin, crawling through my veins toward my heart. The sledgehammer slipped from my grasp, clattering to the floor beyond my reach. "Your blood is my blood," Ambrose continued. "The binding agent flows in your veins naturally. You're the perfect vessel, the culmination of my work." Images flashed through my mind. Ambrose injecting my great-grandmother with the black fluid, their child, my grandfather, carrying the substance in his blood, passing it to my mother, and finally to me. We were all part of his experiment, generations of unwitting subjects. The others were flawed, Ambrose's voice explained. Their consciousness fragmented over time. But you'll retain your identity even as you become part of the greater whole. You'll be conscious within the wall for eternity. The horror of his plan galvanized me. With tremendous effort, I managed to move one arm, reaching not for the sledgehammer, but for my pocket. My fingers closed around my phone. I couldn't call for help. Who would believe me? But there was one thing I could do. As the black fluid crept up my chest, I activated my phone's flashlight, the brightest setting, directly into the mass where Ambrose's face swirled. The effect was immediate and unexpected. The substance recoiled from the light, hissing like water on hot metal. Ambrose's face contorted in pain. "Light disrupts the binding," I realized aloud. "That's why you kept them in the basement, in the dark." Using this momentary advantage, I strained against the hardening substance, breaking free enough to lunge for the sledgehammer. The mass surged forward again, tendrils of black fluid whipping toward me. I swung the hammer not at the wall itself, but at the single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, plunging the basement into total darkness, except for my phone's flashlight. In the new darkness, the mass became more active, more aggressive. I could feel Ambrose's presence growing stronger, his will imposing itself on the collective consciousness of the wall. "You cannot stop this," he hissed. "It's in your blood. It's your heritage." "You're right," I replied, sweeping my flashlight across the surging mass, creating a temporary barrier of light. "It is my heritage, my blood, my choice." I had one chance. In the brief reprieve afforded by the light, I used the sledgehammer to smash open the electrical panel on the adjacent wall. Sparks flew as I ripped out wiring, wrapping the exposed copper around the head of the sledgehammer. The black fluid was climbing up my legs again, hardening faster now. I had seconds at most. With all my remaining strength, I swung the electrified hammer directly into the center of the mass, where Ambrose's face swirled. The effect was catastrophic. Electricity arced through the conductive fluid, illuminating the entire wall from within. The whispers rose to screams, not just Ambrose's, but dozens of voices crying out in what sounded like both agony and release. The black substance convulsed, parts of it crystallizing and shattering, while others liquefied and ran down to the floor. I was thrown backward by the surge, slamming into the opposite wall. The electrical fire spread quickly, following paths of the black fluid across the floor and up the walls. Through the growing flames, I could see the wall of whispers collapsing, the faces within it contorting one final time before crumbling to ash. With the last of my strength, I dragged myself up the basement stairs as the fire consumed everything below. Outside, I collapsed on the lawn, watching as the house, My house, Ambrose's house, was engulfed in flames. Sirens wailed in the distance as I examined my hands in the firelight. The black stain remained, though smaller now, like a birthmark on my palm. Within it, I could swear I saw tiny cracks forming a pattern, the beginning of a face. They treated me for smoke inhalation and minor burns at the county hospital. The official report cited faulty wiring as the cause of the fire, and no one questioned it. Not openly, at least. But I could see it in their eyes when they looked at me, the people of Millbrook. They knew. In the weeks that followed, as I recovered in a motel on the edge of town, strange reports began to surface. Residents complained of unusual cracks appearing in walls throughout Millbrook, in the library, the town hall, private homes. Walls that had incorporated materials from the old hospital. And with the cracks came whispers, though different now. Softer, almost peaceful. Eleonora once visited me, the day before I left town. She didn't ask about the fire, and I didn't volunteer any information. Instead, she took my hand, turning it over to reveal the black stain on my palm. "It's smaller," she observed. "Fading." "Yes," I agreed. "A little more each day." She nodded, satisfied. "They're moving on, not all at once, but gradually. You gave them a way out." She squeezed my hand gently. "But he'll always be with you, you know, a part of him, at least." I knew she was right. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, between sleep and waking, I could still hear him, not threatening now, but watching, waiting. The binding agent was still in my blood, diluted but present. I would never be entirely free of Dr. Ambrose, or his legacy. My book changed direction after Millbrook. No longer a straightforward history of forgotten asylums. It became an exploration of the thin barriers between the physical and the metaphysical, between architecture and consciousness. I never explicitly mentioned what happened in that basement, but the truth was there, between the lines, for those who knew how to read it. I never returned to Millbrook, but I followed the news. 5 years after the fire, the town finally acknowledged its dark past, establishing a memorial for the patients of Millbrook State Hospital. The dedication plaque read, "For those whose voices were silenced, but whose whispers were finally heard." The town systematically removed and properly disposed of all materials from the hospital that had been incorporated into other structures. The whispers faded, then ceased altogether. As for me, the black stain eventually disappeared from my palm, but sometimes, when I place my hand against a wall and close my eyes, I can still hear them. Not Ambrose, but the others, free now and fading like stars at dawn. And sometimes I whisper back, "I remember, I will always remember." Because some walls are more than stone and mortar. Some walls are memory made manifest. And as long as I live, as long as my blood carries that trace of Ambrose's binding agent, I remain connected to them all, the keeper of their stories, the guardian of their whispers. And sometimes, in the deepest part of night, I wonder if that was Ambrose's true purpose all along, not to trap consciousness in walls, but to ensure that some memories, some histories, could never be demolished, never be forgotten. Perhaps that is my inheritance, my purpose, to be the living wall, the final repository of whispers that would otherwise be lost to time. And I accept it, not out of obligation to Ambrose's twisted legacy, but out of respect for those whose voices were silenced in life, but whisper still in memory. I am the wall of whispers now, and I will not crumble.